In this episode of Risk First Stars of Software, I'm joined by Viktor Petersson, founder of SBOMify and co-founder and CEO of Screenly. Viktor is a serial entrepreneur who spent years building real products in the messy intersection of hardware, cloud, and security, from early Raspberry Pi-based digital signage through to a globally deployed platform trusted by organizations like NASA and Capital One. Along the way, he's become deeply focused on one of the hardest problems in modern software, understanding what's really inside the software we run. And that's led him to found SBOMify, a platform focused on software bills of materials, SBOMs, and the broader challenges of software supply chain transparency. In this conversation, we dig into why SBOMs are suddenly everywhere, whether they actually solve the problems they claim to, and what happens when regulation, security, and real-world engineering collide. So, Viktor, welcome to the podcast. Did I capture roughly what we're going to talk about today?
I think so. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Rob. I really much appreciate it. I think you nailed it. I think that's. I mean, there are plenty more to unpack, but let's leave it at that.
So just as a bit of background, in the first episode of the Risk First Stars of Software podcast, we talked to Dom Vogel about cybersecurity, and he was much more on the kind of the implementation side, but you're much more on the sort of like the product side, sort of dealing with that on the other end. So, so can you tell us a bit about Screenly and how Screenly sort of what it's for and what it does in this space?
Yeah, just a quick fun side note. I actually spoke with Dom yesterday, unrelated.
Oh,
so
right.
Just a funny coincidence there. Yeah, so which was about Screenly actually with Dom. what I wanted to to give you kind of context of Screenly, like we've done secure digital signage for over a decade now. We were way too early in this game, and for those not familiar with signage, a lot of people confuse it with signature, which is not. It's these basically displays you have on the wall, right? So it's displaying dashboards, internal communication, could be sensor alerts, anything really where you have something on a remote screen that you manage centrally. That's what Screenly does. We started the company almost 15 years ago now, me and my co-founder, to solve a problem we had ourselves. We stumbled over and we acquired a signage network in Sweden, a small network, 15 screens or so. And we looked at the market, looked at open source tools out there, because we come from open source world, and looked at solutions out there, and we couldn't find anything. So we said, well, how hard can that be? Famous last words, right? We hacked together an initial version, which funny enough was just running a bash script and FFmpeg and rsync and a few other nice tools. And that kind of took us to first kind of like MVP or prototype, I guess. But then we were just happened to be lucky that the very first Raspberry Pi were announced that year, or like literally like months after. So we got up on the wait list on that, and we went from our BOM being a few $100. If you guys remember, people in the audience perhaps, the EEPC back from in the early days, that was what we were running on. And then the Raspberry Pi came out, and we gained from like hardware costing $300 to like $40. Right. So that was a huge change.
Nice. Yeah.
So we basically took our stack, ported it to Raspberry Pi, open sourced it, put it on the Raspberry Pi forum, and it really just exploded. And it became one of the most popular threads on the entire Raspberry Pi forum when the first project, when Raspberry Pi first came out. And it just snowballed from there. And it became like, we never intended to create a company around this. It purely became, people came to us saying, hey, we want this as a managed service. Can you provide us with this? And we did. And then we've, snowballed from there. And then we kind of like doubled down on the security down the way.
Right. So the thing is, when I heard about Screenly, initially I thought, oh, that's not a very big market. I didn't really think about all the places where digital signage occurs. But then after you've heard about the product and you basically start to see digital signs everywhere.
Confirmation bias, right?
So, yeah, I guess it is a bit. But do you want to just give me like 7 or 8 different examples where digital signage occurs? Because I think it is more prevalent than people think.
Oh, way more. So the most common thing that people, once you hear this, they will start paying attention to is within retail. That's kind of one of the biggest areas for signage. We started doing retail, but we don't really focus on retail as a strategic market. But like,
So
if
like
you walk,
fast food signs, that kind of thing.
yeah,
where
that's one example. Like QSR, fast food is one example. But like even you in the grocery store, right? In particular, well, it varies a lot from market to market. In Scandinavia, for instance, they're very prominent in retail. Almost any flagship store you run into for any brand, they will have huge signage installations. That's one example. That's not the example that we focus so much on. We certainly have customers in that user base, but it's not really where we're going after strategically. For us, it's more in enterprises or in manufacturing or in healthcare, where people deploy screens, providing value to either their staff or people attending a conference room or wherever they be, right? You can imagine a lobby in an office complex, or as simple as a calendar or internal comms pushing messages to their staff. Those are kind of more simplistic use cases, but then even more sophisticated use case where you have like telemetry from machinery, for instance, being displayed on a dashboard, and the content changes based on various, like if temperature sensor A in machinery B goes above a threshold, now change the content to show an alert message like it's exceeding, right? So those are the more interesting use cases to me. And then on top of that, we have a developer platform where people can build custom applications that run locally on the device as well.
All right.
So
so I think that covers it. And then there's sort of things. Well, the other places I see a lot of digital signs is like the underground system in London. All the signs are digital there.
Yeah, London is massive for that.
Like at the train stations and things like that.
Airports.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things about Screenly is that you're really focused on security. That's like one of your. That's a core part of your product. Why is that so important? It doesn't seem like digital signs are particularly a high risk element, but you're going to tell me they are, right?
But that's what people think. And it's the classic supply chain security problem, right? I would say signage to a great degree fall under kind of BYOD, kind of like shadow IT oftentimes. Marketing tend to purchase these, they drop them onto the network. The IT team is completely unaware that they even exist in many cases, right? Until it's too late. When we talk about security and signage, and I kind of been banging on this drum for, like I said, almost a decade now, the thing people tend to jump to immediately is kind of people hack the screen, they show porn on the screen, right? Or something like that. And like, that's a PR kind of problem. That's not great, but that's not what keeps me up at night. Like that's still a manageable problem. Like we've seen so many of these, by the way. Like there are like from train stations to like flagship retail store. Like there are like, if you Google for like hacked signage, there are like so many examples of this. But that's not what I'm worried about. There was a good talk at DEF CON last year that really like drove it home to me well and really explained it well, which was there was a signage vendor that, it was the signage provider really, that their signage player got compromised, and the attacker used that as a stepping stone out to the entire cloud infra, and from there were able to compromise their entire cloud infrastructure, right? So they were able to compromise the signage player and then jump on and extract all the credentials and things, and then like move laterally to the rest of the infrastructure. That's far more interesting. Like that's something that really keeps me up at night. And there's another example, not for signage, but there's an example that's fairly often cited that you've probably seen. It was the smart fish tank in Vegas. So there was a fish tank in Vegas, which, because it had to have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, right? So somebody had connected to the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth, and they were able to compromise the casino by jumping onto the fish tank and then onto the network. That could equally well have been signage player, right? And those are the attack vectors that I care about, that I'm interested in, because that's what keeps a CISO up at night. Not the like defacement of like showing porn. Like that's a PR problem. That's not like a real, like if you're the CISO, you're gonna get fired, right?
Okay, so the way they do that, the vector is because the sign is in the wild somewhere, they actually have physical access to that sign and they can start messing around with it. Is that, or
I mean, that's
it a Bluetooth connection? What are they doing?
So there are quite a few scenarios, right? So first of all, at Screenly, we assume that the environment we're deploying is a hostile environment, right? So like very much from the zero trust perspective, right? A vantage point where like we assume that this is essentially going to be on the public IPv4 internet, and like it's going to try to get hacked like every 3 seconds, right? That's kind of like that's the scenario we're playing from. Now from attack vectors, there are the biggest one is from the local network, right? And in many environments, it just dropped on some VLAN, and it's just a matter of time before somebody find their way onto that VLAN and then try to like poke at this device. And Bluetooth, you mentioned, that is an attack vector for sure. Less prominent, I would say, in the signage world. But the reason why I really try to drive this home is because we've done some rudimentary pen test on. I've worked with some people who've done some rudimentary pen tests on signage players out there, and much of the market is nightmare fuels. Like it's really like end of life Debian, no OTA, no signed updates. It's terrible. Open ports, like no security whatsoever, right? That's because much of the signage industry isn't selling to the IT org. They're selling to the marketing org. They care about the fancy UI. They don't care about security updates.
Yeah, exactly. I kind of feel that the same is probably true with like home devices. You know, like just like bought some like remote control power switches in my home,
Yeah.
and I was thinking about these as being a really good attack vector into.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I'm not like a big bank or anything, but
no, but like a lot of that spans boundaries, right? Like a lot of these like automation tools, like the attack vectors are still the same, right? And I mean, and I think that's really what we're trying to raise awareness about is we want to make sure that people consider signage as IT infrastructure and not like some kind of like thing that marketing is drop on the network.
Right. Okay. So you've painted a picture of the risks there, which is really good. So, but then I guess from Screenly's point of view, you're obviously banging on this drum and saying we're secure signage.
Yes.
This is how do you get customers to acknowledge that risk and care about that? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so this is why I said we pay less attention to things like retail, because that's a market where people tend to not care. Like if you're big enough, if you're like a Fortune 500 retail, there are not that many of them, right? But if you're in that domain, right, then yeah, they do have an IT security team, and we have some of those customers. But we pick our customers based on customers who actually care about security, not security theater, but real security, right? And we're talking like companies that goes beyond like, oh, you have a SOC 2 certificates? Good. That's my DD done on you, right? Which is unfortunately a big part of the market, right? No, our ideal customer are customers that have like a CISO or at least like a security team on their payroll that actually can do vendor assessment and security assessment of their vendors. Like that's kind of like we almost like we that's the kind of customer we want because we speak their language.
Right. Yeah. And exactly. And then it's when those sorts of customers evaluate what you're doing that you're actually going to be differentiated from them.
Correct.
Right?
That's correct. And that's why like we if they don't speak our language, like we don't really add value to them. Like if they want just bells and whistles and like fancy UI or like a lot of features, like that's not us. Like we focus on doing we have like a Unix philosophy internally. Like we either do it and do it well, and we do a few things well, or then try to do everything mediocrely.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a minute because how does it differ? Like trying to build a product that is like secure by design rather than just any other sort of IT product where you're not so bothered about security.
I mean, I think it's first. I guess the first thing to acknowledge is this is not a bolt-on, right? This has to start from day zero, right? You need to start thinking about this from very first implementation. For us, that means like working with the right hardware and thinking about like everything from like how software gets to the device, how you build them initially, how you bootstrap them. Like it's not that different from like building a cluster, right? How do you bootstrap a cluster? Like where's trust? How does your trust chain look like? We bought a lot of principles in our software stack from the zero trust principles, right? Like how do we like trust it? So case in point, on our PC-based player, our x86 player, like we use a TPM heavily for all cryptographic identity. That cryptographic identity never leaves the device, right?
Right.
So to answer your question, how you build that, you need to have an engineering team that cares about security, and security is culture. And you need to make sure that you always consider security as a trade-off in your software stack, right? Like, because it will make things more difficult. It always adds friction, but that friction adds a lot of value to your customers, because that's ultimately what we do. So I think the real short answer to your question is, you build a security culture where people actually value security internally, and it isn't viewed as annoying busy work, but rather viewed as a core tendency of your product.
Could you just explain to the audience what zero trust architecture means? Because I think that's a kind of a key principle.
Yeah.
You mentioned it a couple of times now.
Yeah, I mean, so zero trust originated at Google. I mean, I believe this is all public information by now, right? Google back in 2008, 10-ish or so, I think. They, probably earlier, they got compromised and they found like state levels attackers inside of their data center.
Wow.
And they could cipher traffic on the internal VLANs and networks inside Google's data center, right? I think it's fair to assume that these were Chinese hackers, right? What came out of that was that the core principle became, you can't trust anything, not even two internal services speaking to each other. So anything should be assumed being on a hostile network. And I think that's really important. And that assumes within your data center, and it's from your client to your data center. Now, zero trust goes beyond that, but it also has a concept of like threat model or behavioral modeling, so that if you're connecting from a new location, you might have like degraded permission structure until you verify that you are who you are. Like if you connected 5 minutes ago from this location and then 10 minutes later you're in a different country, like you might have like a degraded access. So, and then from a technical perspective, what zero trust usually means is using mutual TLS. So the client, so we're all familiar with TLS, right? Which is HTTPS. Mutual TLS is, not only do I verify that the server has the right certificate and valid certificate, but then the client, in order to connect to the server, needs to present its own certificate. So you provide a cryptographic identity that the server then verifies, and it can say, you're actually Rob. And we know that because our certificate authority issued the certificate to Rob, right? So we know that you can cryptographically verify that you are Rob, and not just, here are a set of credentials that potentially could have leaked, right? Now then, straight like hardcore zero trust tend to even like go into like very short-lived certificates. So like if you talk about Istio, stuff like that in the cloud native world, you tend to use like an hourly certificate renewal. So like it is assumed that a certificate can leak, and the shorter, much like a token, right? That you should rotate your tokens short as soon as possible. Much like that, zero trust certificates oftentimes rotate much more quickly. And you see that with things like Let's Encrypt now. Let's Encrypt uses, I think they're down to like 30-day certificates now when you're using it for a web server or something like that. But it's moving in that direction, because like doing 24 hours or like shorter, or doing like an hour would not work at scale of like the internet as a whole, right? But those are the building block. It's using cryptographic identity heavily, and then behaviorals on top of that. And I think that kind of sums up zero trust pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, so my experience of this is, so if you have two servers and they're in your office or
Yeah.
on your local area network, you don't just trust that the other server is who it says it is.
Correct.
So like you don't accept unencrypted information from it, or unsigned information. You just assume that it's been compromised. And
Correct.
so or rather you assume that somebody else could be pretending to be that server or something like that. And I think that's kind of where
Trust
I
but
come
verify
across it.
kind of. Yeah, it's just like make sure that, because there are scenarios where, I mean, it's better to take that view than the alternative view of defaulted trust.
Yeah. And I think for something like digital signs, you kind of have to take this approach, don't you? Because like if you imagine, like you said, it's a hostile environment. Those signs are out there in the wild.
Yeah.
Anything could be happening to them. You know, some
Yes.
guy could be in there with a screwdriver doing God knows what. And so yeah, you can't necessarily trust that the sign is on your side once it's out of your sight.
And also the thing to add to this as well is many of our signs communicate to very sensitive data sources. So they might be serving like a dashboard for all your like key metrics, and that
Right.
would be
Yeah.
like super sensitive data, right? If that were to leak, that's really bad, right? So securing that connection, and one of the things we're working on right now is having identity-aware proxies on the actual device, which would then you could even then use mutual TLS not only between our device and our backend, but also from our device on your network connect to another endpoint on your network using mutual TLS. Potentially even using your own certificate chain and your entire certificate trust chain for that as well. So you can really say like, even if so we could not even impersonate this device, right, if we
Mhm.
wanted to.
Yeah, that's a really interesting use case. So I'm thinking financial data and stuff like this
Yes.
on screens in offices where you're trying to show the state of a market or something. In fact,
Yes.
if somebody hacked that, that would be
Right.
potentially disastrous, right? That was
Yeah.
material information.
Yeah, and we have some like customers in defense or manufacturing that are like, this is like, if that were to leak, they would be in trouble, right? Because they
Right.
have other people that they are held accountable by in terms of data privacy and data well, governance, I suppose.
So I guess one of the things I wanted to ask you was, you mentioned this earlier, right? Which is that there is a trade-off here between software that is easy to use and accessible for people, and then software that's secure. This kind of is almost like
It's a
one
dichotomy.
of yes, it's a massive tension, isn't it? And it's
Yeah.
one that we always face. I think in the early days of Microsoft, they always leaned towards, well, let's just make it easy to use. And then sometime around the mid-90s, this all kind of came back and bit them, and then they started to have to think about securing everything,
Yeah.
and they sort of like battened down the hatches and just went off to secure as much stuff as they could.
Yes.
But this is I think this is one of the, it's a dichotomy in just software generally, isn't it? And maybe
Yes.
all systems.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we spent a lot of time on discussing and scoping and planning internally. Because the problem that this is maybe not unique to us, but the problem that we deal with is that we need to please both the compliance side of the org. Simultaneously, the end user of the signage platform is oftentimes non-technical. So how do you make it easy enough to use for the receptionist whilst also making sure that the compliance team is happy with all of things security, right? So that's
Mm.
something that we spend a lot of time on thinking about, because it's not easy, right? It's the easiest thing in software is to build a very complicated product. The hardest thing in software is to build a product that is easy to use and it just does enough, right? It just does everything you need it to do without being complicated. And I think based on our customer feedback, we've kind of aced that part, because I think we can, even a non-technical user can use it whilst we have enough things behind the scenes to make the compliance team happy.
Yeah, this is something I talk about quite a lot in Risk First, is like the idea that you have to hit certain features. If you don't hit the features, you're exposing, you're at risk. You have like market risks and feature risks. But then
Yeah,
the downside of meeting all those features is that suddenly your product gets more complicated and harder to understand to people. And yeah,
exactly.
there's a hopefully there's a point in that curve where there's a sweet spot and you're doing exactly the right amount.
Yeah, we always the reference or the example we always use internally as an anti-example of how to build software is Outlook, right? And it's just
Right.
one of those pieces of software that, like, yes, you could do basically anything under the sun with regards to emailing, but it's a terrible product in terms of like UX or UI, right? Because it has so many features and it's just confusing. Like, compare
Mm.
Outlook with Apple Mail, right? They're so polar opposite that you can't find two polar opposite products. Essentially, they're both email products, but you couldn't find two more polar opposite products, right?
Yeah, that's a really good example. I think there is a tendency in products to, over time, you end up accreting features,
Yes.
like they all just get bolted on and added to the
Yes.
product, and
Yes.
then that makes that so. But there is this downside to that. The learning curve of learning the product, the
Yes.
communicating how the product works, suddenly becomes more
Yeah.
difficult. So
Yeah.
while you're pleasing in the it's back to that Microsoft thing again. When you're pleasing people in the short term, over the long term, somehow you're losing as well.
Yeah, one of the things we say internally is, if you need a manual, you fail UI UX.
Right. Yeah.
It should be
That's
intuitive enough that you shouldn't need a manual.
Yeah, it's a good design principle, isn't it? I think that's definitely where I think Apple Mail definitely aspires to that, doesn't it? I think
Oh yeah, if you can't figure it out, it's a bad product.
I think Microsoft Outlook kind of assumes that you're going to be forced to use it anyway.
Yeah, that changed the equation quite a lot, doesn't it? You don't have to make a good UI UX. It's like, wow, I guess Teams is another example of that, right? Nobody says, like, oh, that's a great product. It's just like, I was force-fed this product and I need to use it. And doesn't really matter if the UI and UX is terrible because, well, the decision is already made for me.
Yeah, we're making it free. We're rolling it out to everyone anyway. So
right.
Good luck with that.
Right.
All right. Okay. Let's talk about SBOMs for a bit because you're really heavily focused on this. Well, first of all, can you just give us a brief explanation of what SBOMs are, and then tell us what you're doing in that area?
SBOMs stands for Software Bill of Materials. They've been around for a long time, almost a decade by now. Oh, it's about a decade actually. What SBOMs does is, the best example I could tell you is, you walk into a grocery store, you pick up a bar of chocolate. On the back of the bar of chocolate, you see an ingredient list. It tells you exactly if you got some allergies. It tells you exactly like how to find those things. It's the same for software. It's a list of ingredients that list all the components in your software. So if you're allergic to GPL v3, you can find that, right? You can find that in the SBOM as a company. If you have a policy about licensing, that a complete SBOM would tell you exactly what's in that piece of software. And largely speaking, SBOMs are used for two things. It's for license management. So a lot of companies have policies that they can and cannot use certain open source licenses. This is very common also doing M&A processes, for instance, doing DD there. The other is the more common use case today is for vulnerability management. So if you have a complete picture of what goes into your software, when the next log4j happens, you can just do a quick search in your SBOM and say, here are the exact components that are affected by this vulnerability. Let's go and fix them. Historically, when things like that happen, these massive supply chain problems happen, IT teams scramble to find where they are impacted. And that's kind of where SBOMs solve for. Give you exactly, here's the component that is affected by this particular vulnerability. Now go and fix it. So that's big picture what an SBOM does.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. And you are working with CISA, is that right?
Yeah, so I'll give you the backstory. So about 3 years ago at Screenly, we committed to secure by design. Again, like going into like, we're doubling down on security. Secure by design does a lot of things, and a lot of people say that that secure by design may not be perfect, or secure by default, that is often called today. It's not perfect, but it does do a lot of things well, and it does raise the bar. One of the things that secure by design mandated was that you produce SBOMs for your software suite, which going at this, we thought like, well, that's easy, right? You either go to GitHub, download SBOM, or you go and just pull one of the major tools out there and just generate SBOM, and voila, now you have an SBOM. And then there is a benchmark for a high quality SBOM that's called NTIA minimum elements. And essentially it's what the US government kind of mandates for quality. And it's basically a list of like how your SBOM should look like and what it should include. The problem is, none of the tools that we played with could provide you an SBOM that were compliant with NTIA minimum element. So I scratched my head for a bit, spoke to a bunch of people, and they all had the same conclusion. And there was back, and this has now been kind of sunsetted, but there was a weekly meeting that CISA hosted in the SBOM world, called like a Monday meeting, where everybody got together to talk about SBOMs, completely spread around the world. And I raised this problem, and other people were like, yeah, that's a problem. I wasn't crazy. Turned out to be a real problem. And we then created what they call a Tiger team, or like a working group, where we put together a team, I think we were like 7 of us, where we set out to create a blueprint for how you generate high quality SBOMs. That ended up being generation using one of the tools. We then had augmentation, which is when you include piece of information that you can't infer from the log file, usually the input. And then you enrich it using open data sets, and then you sign it, and then you validate it. So that's kind of the blueprint we developed. And that's one of the first things we discovered. So I was part of that co-chair that, and that in turn, I built a product around called SBOMify Action, which is a fully open source SBOM generation tool that is basically taking that blueprint, and for you to use it, it's just like 5 lines of JSON, and it just like runs in your CI pipeline directly, and it's super easy to use. So it's basically like an opinionated glue, I suppose, of multiple tools to chain together a high quality SBOM. So that was one of the problems we discovered. But the other problem we discovered was, okay, cool. In Screenly, we're not a massively complicated product, but it's a big enough product. We have a backend, we have firmware, we have a bunch of other things. We want to have one SBOM. We are like, I think last time I checked, like it's something to the tune of like 20 different SBOMs, right? We have like Rust here, we have different software there, we have multiple Docker containers, like we have in a Kubernetes cluster, we have like a lot of software. What you realize, if you're going to actually do this at scale, you need to generate everything in your CI/CD pipeline, which is kind of table stakes for like, you need to build your SBOMs there, which is why the GitHub Action module was so important. But more importantly, if you're selling software like we do at Screenly, you need a release SBOM. And that release might happen like multiple times a day. Right? If you're having rolling release, like we deploy like daily. Every time you deploy, you're going to have a new SBOM.
Okay.
And if you are setting yourself up to be able to, we're going to speak about CRA later, I presume. So like in that example, right, you need to be able to provide a point-in-time SBOM to either a customer requests it or through a government body that requests it. That means you need to have release management. And that's kind of the other piece of SBOMify, like is building that release management of like, where do you send them? How do you tag them? How do you create a trust center around SBOMs so that you can have it go and say, oh, version 1.2.3 of Screenly has this SBOM. And then you can have this tree structure of like everything that was included in that snap at point in time.
All right,
That's a lot.
That was a lot. I'm gonna go back a bit.
Yes.
And sort of ask some sort of more foundational questions. But I think this is deep stuff you're already getting into here. But so when I first heard about SBOMs, I was like, I was building like Java libraries and things at the time, and I was like, oh well, this is easy. All I need to do is look at the Maven, like run Maven, get the dependency tree, job's done. But then I sort of over time, I kind of realized that, well, okay, so that's kind of useful on the one hand, but there's all sorts of edge cases around this. So for example, my libraries might download code off the internet as they're running. They might have like sort of dynamic dependencies going on, or they might be pulling in data off websites, or there might be sort of code generated, or there might be bits of open source code that have somehow crept into my code base that have just got sort of landed in there and been imported. And so all of these things kind of make the whole SBOM process, it's kind of an ideal, but the reality on the ground is kind of much more complicated, I guess.
Yeah. So let me unpack that. Like the first thing to note there is, I think the most important reason to start doing SBOMs is to do that inventory that you just mentioned, right? It's like, do I know what goes into my software? Like SBOM aside, does my log file for whatever language I'm using actually capture my software, right? So a good example of that is what you said, like people dropped in a file, like a library in there, or if we talk in the JavaScript world, are we like loading a library in the header of my JavaScript file, right? Like that's a dependency that should be tracked, really. So one of the things that we discovered when doing this at Screenly is like locking down those log files and actually making sure they are complete. And I think that by itself, SBOM aside, that's a very, very useful exercise, because actually now you know what goes into your software, like SBOM aside, right? Now you're talking about pulling in things at runtime. There's a concept in SBOM called source SBOM and runtime SBOM, and they are sometimes the same but sometimes different, because transitive dependencies is a pain in the ass, to be honest, and it really varies by the ecosystem. So if let's go back to Python, for instance, requirements.txt has traditionally been how you package, manage Python dependencies. Requirement.txt makes no assessment or assertion about capturing all the transitive dependencies. If you have one line in there, let's say Django equal version XYZ, it will happily, when you do pip install like R, requirement.txt, pull in like 20 dependencies, right? So if you saying, hey, SBOM generator, generate an SBOM for me from requirement.txt, you will have a very, very incomplete SBOM. Now, if you're using a modern package manager for like UV for Python, for instance, the uv.log will have not only all your transitive dependencies, but also the hashes for all those dependencies, right? So it varies a lot, the generation of log file you're using or the generation of tooling you use for log files. Now, you talk about loading things dynamically. That's difficult, in particular in the Java world. And I know some of the toolings will essentially, for SBOM generation, will essentially load your entire Java app, do that traverse, that dependency tree, and only then will it take that output to generate an SBOM. So SBOMs are riddled with edge cases. But I think it's important to not go down and aim for perfect, but aim for let's start with something, because it's still better to have a 99% complete SBOM than like going for the pursuit of perfection. Because there is no such notion of saying a complete SBOM, because you can't assert that it's complete, right?
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, you can if you respect both sides, but like it becomes really, really difficult.
The other thing, so going back to your like chocolate bar example, if you're like, I think it was a chocolate bar where you're buying something, like you maybe have like 10 or 15 ingredients in there, but often, especially with like JavaScript, you end up with these massive package lock files with thousands of different modules in them that it's downloaded. And that would be, if I bought a chocolate bar with 1,000 ingredients in, that would be a horrendously frightening.
I would say that the NPM ecosystem is pretty frightening in general, but that's a different story. There have been so many supply chain attacks in the NPM world in particular, right, over the last few years, and part for that reason.
Yeah, and so another side of this that kind of that I kind of think about is if you're, I'm sure Screenly don't do this, but another company might think to themselves, well, we don't want to really report everything that's in the SBOM or everything that's in our product because some of this is a bit sketchy. We'd rather people didn't know we were using X, Y, or Z. So you've got that whole problem of whether you trust the publisher of the SBOM with what they've published, right?
Yeah. No, this is absolutely true, right? And this is why it's so important, in my view, that SBOMs are always generated in the CI pipeline. Right. Because then if you generate with an input being a log file and you sign it at the end of that process, there is no way to tamper with it. And I think that's so important. And it goes in SBOMify as well. We assume that you don't trust SBOMify as a transportation layer. You should always be able to work yourself backwards to generation. How you sign it, I care less about. Like there are plenty of, like, you do cosign, you can like sign with PGP, you can sign with X519. That matters less. But the fact that you can work your way back to some kind of trust anchor is super important. Because what if you email the SBOM, right? How do you know, to your point, right? There are plenty of SBOM management platform out there that if you upload your SBOM to them, they would do stuff to it, right? And it's like, okay, but then I no longer trust SBOM. Like, how do I know that you didn't remove that one component with the vulnerability? I have no assertion of that. But if it goes all the way back to your CI pipeline and I have an attestation of that run, I can at least see how it was generated.
Yeah, so that and so you can unless they sort of excluded the information up front. But I guess the point is that they probably want to exclude things after some vulnerability has occurred, or like
precisely
go change the SBOM retrospectively. You can definitely avoid that, right?
Precisely, yeah. And I think that's so important to drive home, right? Like there are so many tools out there that will do these like enrichment and augmentation post-generation. But for us, it's so important that all that happens directly in your pipeline so that you can cryptographically trust that it has not been tampered with.
Yeah. One of the other things I worry about with this is that, let's say a vulnerability gets published,
Yeah.
and if you're publishing your SBOMs, that's kind of like an invitation, isn't it, to attackers to go look for products where the vulnerability exists, and then go
Yeah.
and try and hack them before they get a chance to.
Yeah, I mean, yes, you're right. And most regulations, I'm talking about both the executive order, which kind of fast-tracked SBOMs in the US market, but I'm also talking about CRA, for instance, in the European market. None of them make an assessment, the fact that you need to make the SBOMs public. They just say you need to generate them and then have
Right.
them available upon request. There are plenty of companies out there that would be very uncomfortable publishing their SBOMs, and CVs being one of those reasons, right? But then I guess we're living in almost like a post-CVE world these days anyways, where like the CVs are flying by so fast these days. I think I don't really know, like I saw some data on this. I don't know if it's true, but like the CV reporting to exploit is like measured in minutes now, right? And
Right.
I've spoken to CISOs and security teams where they view CV reporting as a lag indicator, and assuming like by the time the CV is public, that's already been exploited for a while.
Yeah. Okay.
So yes, but it depends on who you are as an organization, right? And what threat model you have, right? It all comes down to that. Because if you have nation state attackers knocking on your door on a daily basis, you should assume that the time that CV is public, you've already been compromised.
That's really interesting. I think I've definitely talked on the podcast before about how CVEs is like on an exponential tear, where the number of them is increasing exponentially all the time, and so it's kind of impossible to keep on top of them. So, what comes next then? If we're in a post CVE world, Viktor, where do we go from here with that?
I think that's super interesting question, and I think. So one thing that's important to mention about CV is that just because you're using a library which has a CV doesn't mean that you're affected by that.
Yeah, that's one of the most frustrating things about. Yeah.
Right. And you have two, like, so if we're living in the SBOM world and we're saying, so you generate an SBOM and you're affected by it, like you have two paths, right? You can either blindly upgrade and patch it, or you can issue what's called a VEX file, which is essentially a statement saying, yes, we're affected by this. However, that function foobar that is actually the vulnerable code in the CV, we're not using that. So then you can issue what's called a VEX file that basically suppress that warning, and then you basically. But that's a manual process, or like heavily
and that's that's a really tedious business as well. That's almost as tedious as upgrading the software in the first place.
Yeah, so that's oftentimes the upgrade is cheaper, right? But to answer your question, what I think we're starting to see more and more, and I don't know what this is good or bad, but one could certainly argue, and I heard plenty of people arguing about this, saying that it changes how you use open source, right? Because in most scenarios, if you're depending on a library, with the exception of maybe crypto and some like really, really hardcore libraries, oftentimes when you use a library, you're using like a very, very small part of that component library, right? You might use like a few functions from a library when you're building on top of it. Well, one could argue that it's just from a risk perspective, it's going to be better for Claude to just write that particular function.
Right? Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah.
And
that's one approach. Yeah.
I mean, but you will not be vulnerable to CV. Like, could you still have vulnerability in your source code? Yeah, sure, you could. You certainly could. You certainly could introduce new problems. You certainly could create a worse scenario. But it all depends on your skill set and all that. But you could argue that in many ecosystems, particularly we talk about NPM ecosystems, I would honestly trust Claude to write better code than pulling in a random JS dependency.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It would be much nicer to not have thousands of dependencies pulled into my project and just instead have like maybe 40, 50, 60 or whatever extra functions to deal with. I'd much prefer that trade-off if that was available.
And it's also a lot easier to audit, right? Because now you don't have to like traverse that code you're including from somewhere. So to answer your question, I think that's where much of this is heading. And I think it's not to say that it's all doom and gloom and open source is dead. That's not the point. But the point is that there are so many of these attacks in the supply chain world are against, I mean, you have typo squatting, but certain ecosystems are more prone than others into like writing libraries that really shouldn't be libraries because they're so basic, right? And JavaScript world is particularly prone to do that, where like you have these helper libraries that are like literally there's like 40 lines of code, right, to do something very, very basic, right?
Because the standard library is so minimal, isn't it?
Right.
You that's the reason for that.
Yeah.
But yeah. I kind of agree with this, but I think there's what I'd like to see is something else where if I'm pulling it, I think there is still a huge use case for like frameworks, large libraries. Anytime you're talking to like, I don't know, another system, you need some kind of like layer that's going to translate us. There's still tons of use for open source, but
yes,
what I would like to see, I think, and this requires a major retooling, is for open source libraries to explain what they need to do, like the capabilities they want to export, or the things that they need, and then for you as a developer to say, okay, I'm allowing this library to write to this area of the file system or make a network call, or I'm allowing it to do this, or this, or it can talk to this other library. And then should a vulnerability arise, you'd be able to say, oh, this vulnerability applies or doesn't apply automatically. But also, if a library somehow gets compromised and tries to do some kind of crazy stuff in the future, it would step on all of these boundaries and alarms would go off, and hopefully you'd spot it.
Yeah, I mean, I am excited to see like the improvements we've seen in the last few years, like last year about library management, right? So the two that springs to mind, I mean, both of them have been acquired now, unfortunately, but both Bun and UV, right? And Bun got acquired by Cloudflare, and UV got acquired by OpenAI, right? But they are massive improvements to the ecosystem in general, and they add a lot of improvements to supply chain security, and simultaneously, the ecosystems are doing a lot. So there was a PEP 770 for Python, which allows you to bake SBOMs into wheel files for Python. So there are like a lot of like attestation is getting a lot easier and a lot better in the supply chain in general, but capability based, I haven't seen anything around that at least. But I mean, I feel optimistic that we're going through a bit of an evolution in terms of like how we treat supply chain security across all languages, mostly, or at least across many languages, at least.
What do you think about? So you touched upon a really interesting thing there, where you said that all these package managers, all these sort of infrastructure components are getting bought up by private companies. What do you think about that? And then maybe a sort of a related question is, isn't this inviting more regulation? Aren't they going to start getting regulated?
I mean, what I make out of it, like the reality is that it's very hard to monetize open source. It's hardly a new problem, right? But if you're looking at, I mean, because we've seen this, much of this comes down to money at the end of the day, right? Like if you look at things like Tailwind, more popular than ever, and they had to lay off like 6% of their staff because nobody's actually paying them anymore, right? So that's a big problem. Do I think it's bad or good that there are acquisitions in this space? I think it depends. I think as long as there is alignment in what's best for the ecosystem, which I believe there is, right? I'm not a huge fan that they've all been picked up, but at the same time, it's better that they have resources now, and now they have paid staff that can actually work on them, because monetizing open source is tremendously difficult. And I feel like it's something that it's almost like a dirty topic to speak about, in particular in the open source world. But the reality is that GitHub stars are not going to pay your mortgage as much as you want. But there seems to be like a preconceived notion that it's dirt to talk about monetization in open source, right? Other than potentially consulting, but that doesn't scale anymore.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the regulation side of this, because you mentioned CRA earlier. What where's this going? Because I kind of think like a lot of this stuff we've been talking about in terms of secure by design and
Yeah,
SBOMs and
yeah,
vulnerability reporting,
yeah.
all of this stuff is now becoming like is moving into the eyes of the regulators. They're starting to look at this stuff, and it's becoming completely critical.
Yeah, I think it's important to start with saying security at large is a market failure, and it will not correct itself
Yeah,
without regulation, right? I'm not. Let's be clear. I'm not a fan of heavy-handed regulations. I think it's not something that I would like to see. I would much rather have seen the market self-regulate. Not gonna happen. If that was the case, we would not have seen all these baby cameras hacked because basically like there is no security. Because security,
yeah,
your average, because it comes down to education ultimately, right? Your average consumer doesn't care, and nor do they want to pay for security, right? So it's from a game theoretical perspective, it's a losing playbook, right? Um, I do think there are a lot of upsides with CRA, and yes, for those not familiar with CRA, EU Cyber Resilience Act, it's something that's going to go into the first phase of deployment this year with a firm deployment next year, and it takes a lot of. It basically raised the bar significantly for what security needs to look like for anybody selling products into the European market. And it applies to anything, and they call it a product with digital elements. So essentially anything that can speak to the internet directly or indirectly is impacted by this. And it does a lot of things. Like it's a comprehensive framework, and I don't want to dive into exactly what it says, but long story short is that you need to do good security posture for all these devices. You need to have update framework in place. You need to have vulnerability management in place. You need to produce SBOMs. You need to know what's going into your software, and you need to have a playbook for cybersecurity at large, amongst many other things. And is it a bit heavy-handed? Perhaps, but it's something got to change. Otherwise, we're not doing any, like we're racing to really a bad, like it's going to get worse from here otherwise, right? And I do think CRA is going to be interesting, and there are a lot of parallels with GDPR in terms of implications. But what the EU regulatory body learned from CRA was that fines are not enough, because back in the CRA day, GDPR days, it just became cost of doing business in Europe. Like Meta and those guys are like, oh, you got to fine me 100 million a year? Fine, whatever. We're just going to write that as a cost of doing business in Europe, right?
yeah,
Now, CRA does things differently, and this is where it gets really, really interesting. Stick is not a fine. The stick is blocking access to the European market. So if you're not compliant, your product cannot be sold into the European market. And it goes along with the CE certificate. That's a much, much heavier stick that no company could just say, cost of doing business in Europe, right? Because like there is no doing business in Europe without that.
yeah. Yes, yeah. I mean, this is sort of just landing now, isn't it? So it's going to be interesting to see how this works out. I mean, so within finance, people are talking about this. We're sort of hearing a lot about it. Obviously, it affects things like banking apps that you have on your mobile phone.
Yeah.
I guess, websites, that kind of thing. But I guess that's it. I think it's aimed at things like the baby monitor type thing, or the smart fridge, all that kind of stuff. But I think it's certainly gonna go wider than that, and it'd be interesting to see how Europe or the European governments like police this and make it work. So it's
absolutely.
it seems like a step in the right direction.
I mean,
definitely.
it's going to be a pain in the ass for a lot of companies, right? And the scary part is that I gave a talk last week at a conference, and had a room full of like C-suites, CTOs, CISOs, and architects people. Before I gave my talk, I just did a poll, like how many people are aware of CRA. Less than half people were aware of it, right?
Right. Yeah.
And then I asked, like, how many of you do you think are affected or impacted by CRA? And that's even less, right? And then I'm like, well, hate to break it to you, but it's all of you.
And these are people turning up to conferences where CRA is kind of a topic du jour at a lot of conferences now. So
correct, yeah, exactly.
If you took that sample of people who don't go to conferences, you're just gonna get crickets, I think.
Well, that's it. Like, and that's kind of like one of the things we're trying to build. Like, so SBOMify is like an open source platform, right? And one of the things we're building there is the CRA easy button, right? Because we
Right.
fully
Yeah.
acknowledge that the vast majority of people are not the people in that room. They are like the SMBs and SMEs who might have like even an outsourced engineering team. Like they don't have like a CISO, right? They
Mm.
just need to be, who do I pay to make this go away, essentially? And that's is where the big market lives, to me at least. And that's kind of where with SBOMify, we try to build. Like you can self-host it, like if you can run it free of charge, right? You can self-host it, we can run it hosted. But ultimately, that's the playbook we're building out on, like just making it easier for all these people to just be compliant ultimately.
So let's get into the sort of entrepreneurship side of what you do, because I think this is really fascinating. But one of the questions I wanted to ask you, so for something like SBOMify, right, you are basically playing in a really crowded space. From my point of view, there is so many different that right. So here's the problem, right? If you're working in like a bank or something, the security landscape is really complicated. First of all, you've got all these
Yep.
different attack vectors. You've got all these
Yep.
CVEs. You've
Yep.
got like things like Vex and SBOM, but then you've got a million different companies all trying to sell you their solution to um, how to do security in
Yep.
that organization.
Yep.
And obviously you can't buy everything, and that would be a disaster anyway. A lot of them are snake oil salesmen.
Oh yeah.
How as an entrepreneur, how do you navigate that? How do you try and avoid or how does that problem look to you, I guess, is the question.
Yeah. It's a great question. Um, Ultimately, we're not trying to solve every problem under the sun, and it kind of goes back to what you were saying before. And what I really want to focus on is the two things that we're trying to solve for with SBOMify, which is the generation piece, which is open source. You can use it with or without SBOMify, right? It's fully like there, it's out there. And then it's the management layer and the, I guess, release management, I suppose, or transportation layer. Those are the core tendencies that we're focusing on. There aren't that many people doing that. Now, there are a ton of companies out there that are doing SBOM analysis for whatever niche they're doing, right? We're not trying to go after that. What we are doing is we're building a hub that can integrate with other solutions. That's our kind of like position here. Like we generate it, you can push it to our hub, which in turn can federate out to whatever tools you're already using. So if you have, for instance, like we pick on two tools out there, dependency track, which is a very popular tool for doing vulnerability management for SBOMs. We integrate with that. So we can send it to dependency track for vulnerability analysis and then pull back the results. Guac is another example. It's an OpenSF project now
Yeah.
for doing kind of like tree analysis of SBOMs. That's something that we're looking to build integrations with as well, so that we're not trying to compete with all these tools. We're trying to be the hub that can federate out to all the other tools, because we're never going to get better at graph management than Guac. We're never going to get better at vulnerability analysis, the dependency track, and so forth. That's not our purpose. We are the transportation layer. And I think that's an important distinction. I don't think that's not a crowded market. And part
Right.
of the reason, because it's relatively new. The reason why it's new is because you don't have this pain point until you actually start to do SBOMs at scale.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like why that space is interesting to me. And regulatory industry, regulated industries like banking, is completely different. I mean, they would have to run it on-prem. Like, yeah, maybe we have some customers in that space that could do like consulting and they run them themselves. But what we're building a universal platform essentially that can be used for all different segments. But we try to solve for that particular problem. It's generation and then transportation. That's really what we do. And then I guess the other unique part is, once we have that data, we're building a trust center. And I'm really bullish on trust centers because CRA now mandates that you do SBOMs. I think it's a very, very reasonable assumption that all future compliance frameworks, be SOC 2, be ISO, they're already all going to start to mandate SBOMs as a litmus test. Do you know what goes into your software?
Yeah.
Now, we've already seen this with PCI DSS 4.0, for instance. FDA is already starting to mandate SBOMs. So like SBOMs will become a universal litmus test across all frameworks of like, do you know what goes into your software? We're building a trust set that the SBOM first. Bolting on the controllers is easier than bolting on SBOMs in many ways because they have very, very different release cadences.
So I think what you're saying basically is that the answer to this question is you have to find a niche, right? You have to
Yes,
niche
correct.
down and do something that nobody else is doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think so this kind of like ties into like the state of the universe right now with AI generated code. What matters today is not, the moat is not writing code. The moat today is insights that what do you know nobody else knows. So in this example, we know that release management of SBOMs is a pain in the ass because we have to do it, right?
Right.
But few people know that. And the other thing is taste, because an AI agent doesn't have taste. It does what you tell it to do. And those are the two components I think matters today, generally speaking.
Nice. And so, well, since you brought up AI, right? In the news quite a lot of the moment this week anyway is about Anthropic's Mythos platform. Apparently, some amazing. I couldn't quite tell from the discussions whether it was really good at cybersecurity or really good at like attack or defense, basically. Whether it was,
I think it was really good at
maybe
wowing
both.
I think it was really good at wowing Wall Street and thinking that all of the cybersecurity is now dead, right?
Yeah. So all the cybersecurity firms took a bath on this news, right? Because I think about 2 weeks before that, all the legal software firms took a bath because of Anthropic producing some kind of legal, AI.
Yeah.
So okay, so taking a step back, then, so how does AI affect the world of cybersecurity products? Then, is this a fair analysis, or is this kind of just a knee-jerk reaction?
I think it's a bit of both, and I think it's true that it will impact things in a lot of ways, and there are plenty of tools out there that leveraging AI in very, very unique ways that you really can't do by hand, right? Scanning the entire, it's like we talk about CVs being like a lag indicator in these days for like if you're being attacked against, if you're trying to protect yourself against like the really serious attackers. There are tools out there that will scan all of GitHub in real time and essentially say, this repo has been compromised before you even know it, right? And I think GitHub as an attack vector has become like tremendously important in the last like month or two, like with Trivy, LightLM, and there are quite a few others that have been compromised. So tools that can detect, like, because CVs will not help you with that, right? When Trivy get compromised, like, it's already too late. Like a CV is like, okay, cool, but my entire pipeline is already fucked, right? So like, great, but it's already too late, right? So I think tools that can do at scale, AI tools that can do things at scale like that, they are super interesting, right? Now, we shouldn't throw away common sense just because of AI. And a lot of like security posturing, AI can't solve that per se. Maybe they can building, but ultimately security is culture. And security comes down to people. And I think let's not lose track of the fundamentals. Like, people always try to find the panacea and they're like, oh, now we have this tool, like everything changes. But like in reality, like, yeah, they have, but also the fundamentals are still the same, right? Like, let's not lose track of the fundamentals of security. And I think that's so important. Like, rotate your keys, use short-term tokens, like these fundamental things, or use workload identities. Like, the AI tool is not going to solve for that. Like, they might help you get there, but ultimately you need somebody in charge to actually like implement a strategy and build around that. So I think they are fantastic tools, and we use them extensively in every engagement I have. Like, we barely write code by hand anymore. And like, they're fantastic tools, and both for scanning and building code and auditing code, they're great. And they will definitely shake things up. Like, static code analysis tools are like being like changed a lot, in particular around AI, like being able to analyze large code bases, right? So I think it was a knee-jerk reaction in the sense of like Wall Street just thinks like doom and gloom, right? Like, oh, now all of AI is done, right? Like all cybersecurity is done. But like, that's not really how the world works, right? It's just like saying, everything is gone. Like, we still need the fundamental. Like, yes, this will be short-term correction, but ultimately we still need kind of the same tools. They just got to do the job slightly differently and probably better.
I'm going to give you my take on this, and then
Mm.
you can tell me why I'm wrong. But so I think, apart from one area, I think actually these AI tools are going to be great for cybersecurity generally.
Mhm.
And my argument is this: like, on the projects I work on, like, documentation is now getting way better,
Yeah.
because you can just get the AI to like summarize the code, the documentation of pull requests, for example, or just even commit
Oh, yeah.
messages. It's getting way better,
Yes.
and I feel like documentation is a bit like security. It's one of those kind of things that's like maybe not on the critical path of the software. You can get the software working without it, but it's a nice to have. And maybe you can do it tomorrow. Whereas with the AI doing it, suddenly these things come into scope and it can be done much more easily and much more quickly. So I kind of feel in that respect, like the security posture of open source projects should improve massively, probably just all products, right? I mean, okay, I'm a bit obsessed with I work in open source, so that's why I'm talking about that. But I kind of feel like it's going to be a good thing. I feel like it's a good thing for like tools like Sneak and those kind of like systems analysis tools as well. But the one area that I kind of worry about is like the human aspect. I kind of feel like the quality of spam messages, for example, that I'm getting now
Oh,
is
yeah.
way up. And I've watched these videos of people being like, uh, using face change software and all this
Yeah.
kind of stuff to like
Yeah.
scam people. That is the one area that, like, obviously if all of our software is getting a better security posture because AI is both on the attack and defense side, but people are now going to become even more of a weaker and easier target.
So do
That's
we?
my view.
So are we essentially a net neutral then? Is that because? I mean, I don't think you're wrong, right? I think, to your point, we use AI extensively for both writing code, viewing code, and like massive fan. Don't get me wrong, and I don't even know how the landscape will look like in 6 months, right? Because that's
Mm,
how quickly things are. Really, like, it's almost like hard to imagine a world before like Claude, right? I can't barely imagine like going and writing like boilerplate code anymore. Like, that's just like I can't internalize that anymore at all, right? So you're absolutely right that I think we gotta raise the security posture. But I think, yes, we will probably use AI to view massive bodies of log events or event streams better than you could write a regex to parse the critical event, right? Because it can
right.
do
Yeah.
better, right? So I think, yeah, I think the tools will get better, but I guess in many ways it's incrementally better. It's not revolutionary better, right? You're still solving the same, like instead of log analysis. Yes, it's going to do a better job, but you're still analyzing logs. You might do it at a higher scale and you might do it better, but you're still analyzing logs. Writing code, yes, I would say Claude today with Opus 4.7, whatever we are, right, writes better code than most engineers. So yes, we will have better code. And then add a few review cycles, you're absolutely going to have that. I mean, we're ultimately becoming architects, right? Every
Yeah.
engineer is an architect with agents working for them.
Yeah. That's pretty much it, isn't it? Um. All right. So let's try and wrap this up before we finish. Right. I like to ask people a couple of things. So, um, first question is like you're basically an entrepreneur, aren't you? You've set up a bunch of different companies. So have you got any advice for people wanting to follow your career path? Um,
Yes. The thing I try to really tell, in particular junior people, but um, even senior people, because I think this never becomes irrelevant, is have side projects. Side projects, work on open source projects, have side projects. Side projects are so important because they allow you to experiment. And even if they fail, that experimentation you might take into your day job. And I think that is so important. Work on open source, try new things. Like, it doesn't matter if you bin the project, like, just trying new things, experiment with new workflow, experiment with new languages, experiment with new methodologies. I think that is so important. I was funny enough chatting with somebody who was like just graduated university at a conference last week, and that was my takeaway. Like, get involved with open source. Like, like, you have time. The luxury of being young is that you have time, and you can spend time on that. And like, let's be real, like, this is a very competitive industry. Like, the days of working 9 to 5, I mean, yeah, maybe some can do it, but like the reality is that you need to keep yourself sharp, and you need to be able to like keep up with latest technologies, and that oftentimes comes from side projects. I think that's a big thing. And same thing for like trying to make your way into the industry. Like, hiring today and finding a job today is tremendously difficult, because and let's be real, like, we hire, and I almost exclusively hire from my network, because
Right.
it's so expensive to hire today. Because I give you an example. We put up an offering last year for a job, and I think within 48 hours we had like 300 applicants. And
Wow.
it's just like, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, even if we did have that volume, screening those resumes would be so quick, because we had some really good filter questions that we just like, okay, we can find the 1% out of those applicants by reviewing their resume in like 30 seconds, right? Or 10 seconds even. But today it's almost impossible, because applicants are using AI to fill out their applications, and we're using AI to review the application. So it's like AI reviewing AI, right? So like, what's the human side of that? So what that means is like, and bringing this back to side projects, and this is kind of the advice I gave to that person I was speaking to at the conference, like, find something you're interested in, look at their open source stuff, and get involved. Because that is how you sidetrack the entire application flow of like 500 applicants in 24 hours or 48 hours, right? You build a rapport with the people on the inside, and they can see, oh, this person, I like it. Like, they're doing a great job. Like, I like it. That's how you get in. Always hack the system, right? Never try to go through the front door.
Can I yes and you on the side projects?
Of course, yeah.
So I think there's two other good reasons for having side projects as well. One is like having tracked down the job, right? What you tend to find is that the job, like the stuff you end up doing on your job, is maybe not always 100% what you want to be doing.
Sure.
And having a side project is a great way of keeping your enthusiasm for software going, because you're working on something that you're really passionate about. So sometimes the passion can be absent from the working environment, but then you find it, or you can keep the flame alive with the side project. The other thing is, so I have this side project that I've been working on for I'm not even going to say, for a long time, to do with diagram layout. And the problems that I'm solving on my side project are so fiendishly complicated. Obviously, when I started it, I had no idea about diagram layout. And so I was just like completely oblivious to this. But the great thing about that has been that it's made me such a better programmer as a result of it. Like, the problems that I get to solve at work are actually quite trivial by comparison. It's usually like, put this value on this screen. Whereas, and I guess that is essentially what I'm doing with the diagram layout as well, but it's just way more complicated.
Yeah.
And so you end up with skills that you might not even have thought that you could develop by doing things like
100%.
this. So,
And I mean,
yeah.
I still have a ton of side projects, even between all my
Yeah.
companies. Like, I wrote the new home automation system because I was really annoyed with Home Assistant. So I literally wrote the home automation system.
Right.
Like, because why not, right? And so, but that teaches me about things that I didn't know, right? And
Right.
like, now I understand Zigbee better. Well, cool. That's pretty cool. Or like whatever it is, right? But like, that expands to anything really, because now I've been in tech for like almost 20 years. And this is probably the time I'm most excited about being in tech right now.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. It just gets better all the time.
Yeah, because you could do so much stuff like that. This home automation system, there's no way I would have done that 5 years ago. Because
Right.
I mean, I could not justify spending weeks writing Rust code to like turn off my lights. Like, that makes no sense, right? But with Claude, a few evenings and I have a system.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah.
So never stop learning. That is my biggest career advice for anybody, really. Like, never, like, always try to get out of your comfort zone, learn new things. And like, that applies for both juniors and seniors, like, because you don't want to get stagnated. You don't want to like stop growing.
Yeah. And I think just on that, like the AI thing, right? It seems to me that using AI is a whole new, like you said, we're architects now, right?
Yes.
You have to be good at software architecture to make the
Yes.
most of these tools. And
Yes.
I think at some level that's not going to change. I think there's only so much you can just expect the AI to do off its own back.
Yes.
There's always, you're the interface between what's needed and
Yeah.
what it understands. So,
Yes.
so I think a lot of people say, oh, well, that's the end of software development now. But for me, I think this is a really interesting
No,
inflection point, and it's going to be,
I couldn't agree more. I think to me, you still need. The only thing I would say is it puts potentially juniors at a massive disadvantage, because in order to build something new, it assumes you know so much about the fundamentals and how you build architectures. Like, we used to talk about the T diagram or the T personalities, right? That one you used to hire, you used to want the T personality. People can go somewhat
yeah,
wide, but then they have something like they're really deep. I think that's changed, and now we're looking for like almost like the V personality, right? Where you can know a lot about a lot of things, but maybe not. Maybe U personality is better because you never have to go all the way down, but you have a wide knowledge of skills, but you're not really like, I'm not a specialist or anything.
yeah.
I know a lot about a lot of things, but I'm not like a specialist at like memory management and Rust or whatever that might be, right? But I understand a lot about a lot of things, which gives me a pretty good architecture position because I have opinions about how things should be doing across a wide spectrum of things.
Yeah, no, I think that is all right. I think beginners or people graduating now are a huge advantage. My head is full of all kinds of nonsense that I don't need to know anymore. Like that the AI has internalized. I spent years learning about, I don't know, binary, ASCII,
Yeah.
basic, all sorts of crazy things that is absolutely redundant now.
Yeah.
And so if you're just starting out, most like graduates are able to learn things faster than I can. They're like empty buckets. They just like pick up everything really quickly. I feel
Yeah.
like they're a huge advantage.
I would,
Admittedly, I
yeah.
know more about like software architecture, and that's
Yeah.
the thing that's the thing I put in my suitcase that I'm taking forward into the future. But
Yeah.
I don't think it's that complicated.
I saw something on whatever was on LinkedIn the other day. It's like, to your point about advantages. One could argue that they have the biggest advantage of all because all their peers are just scrolling TikTok all day. So you just swap out TikTok and you have like 5 hours a day to your advantage. That's your competitive edge.
Right. Yeah. If you're immune to social media, you're laughing, and that's the irreplaceable skill right now.
Right.
Well, look, Victor, I think we should leave it there. It's been absolutely fantastic talking to you. Thanks
you
for
for
coming on the podcast. It's been really fun. Is there anything else you want to just end with? Anything you're doing?
Yeah, I mean,
that you want to just
if you care about supply chain security or SBOMs in general, check out SBOMify. If you need secure signage, check out Screenly. You can run SBOMify self-hosted if you want. If you're assume this audience is from mostly financial services, you can run that. Regardless of what you're looking for, I'm happy to help. Just reach out to me on LinkedIn, probably where I'm mostly. Yeah, drop me a line, connect to me there, and happy to chat about anything security.
Awesome stuff. Thanks a lot, Victor.
Thanks, Rob.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Right.